Today, we'll be talking about someone Solomon seemed to know a lot about.
We'll also be discussing how we can stay on the right track.
My name is Logan Bruce.
And I'm Zach Griffin.
Thank you for joining us for Bearing Up. Today, we are brought to you by the Ministry League Network. So go ahead and go check them out. We've talked a little bit about them, and you can check them out on their website or their app.
Also, please don't forget to share this video, like, follow, subscribe to us, and we want to make sure that you check out also our Teespring shop where you can get lots of Bearing Up products. You can also find some other things there that we're sort of getting into. So please be sure to check that out.
So Zach, it's been almost a week, man, since we've done this. How have you been?
I'm doing pretty good, man. It's been a good week. I think I may take a day off tomorrow, go fishing. It's been good. It's been good.
What I want to do today, Zach, is I want to talk about our own personal social medias because, maybe a lot of people follow us on the Bearing Up social media, but Zach and I have some pretty fire social medias personally as well. Zach's son, Graham, is all over his. I don't know if you're as big into Instagram as I am, Zach, but...
No. I'm not really a social media person so much. I share pictures of Graham and videos of Graham, mostly for family.
Right.
I'm one of those shadow social media people. So like I can see what you're posting, but I don't really post. And so you really don't want to follow me.
Oh, that's not what we want.
I mean, you can. I mean, one of the things though is if I don't recognize you, I'm one of those. Like I have to go on your profile and figure out who you are first. And if I don't have any mutual friends, then you're likely to get deleted. So
I'm the opposite. If I can tell you're an actual human and not somebody pretending to be somebody else or a robot, I'll accept your friend request or accept your follow. Zach posts about his son. I like to post about my daughter, and she does this thing every week where we project the football, the NFL.
Cool,
the NFL winners of each week. So she does we do every game, but I only put a few on there. So she's really funny with that. We like to do that. But yeah, we just to check us out, I guess I wanted to promote our own personal social medias because you can stay in touch with us even better that way sometimes. But anyway, moving on from that. Zach, what kind of recommendation you got today, man?
Well, we're going to be diving into the Proverbs later, and so I wanted to discuss a book that's written by a good friend and a fellow preacher. His son's about my age, so I think he's an elder in the church too, in addition to being a preacher. I could be wrong about that. We both have preached at the same congregation before too, which is kind of neat.
That's cool.
But his name is Warren Baldwin, and I love the cover of this. It's called Charging Grizzlies, Rude Neighbors, and Other Gems from the Book of Proverbs. And I love this book. I've got a signed copy, so if you order you're not going to have a signed copy, unfortunately. But it's pretty neat. He organizes this in kind of a topical way, but he pulls out these nuggets that are in the book of Proverbs and kind of delves into them a little bit. One of the verses that actually, I guess the title of this book comes from, the Charging Grizzlies. I believe it's Proverbs chapter 17 and verse 2, it's Proverbs 17:12. Better for a person to meet a bear robbed of her cubs than a fool in his foolishness. So that's where that Charging Grizzlies comes from. But he actually goes into that verse and explains and talks about it. And it's just a great book to I believe Proverbs is a great book to study. But oftentimes, if you don't have any guidance there, it just kind of seems like a whole bunch of unrelated things just kind of stacked on top of each other. And so this offers a kind of a methodical way of looking at the book of Proverbs. So check it out. It's called Charging Grizzlies, Rude Neighbors, and More Gems from Proverbs, Warren Baldwin.
Very nice. Thank you, Zach. I think I've heard of that book, but I've never read it, and I definitely don't know the author. But that's pretty cool. My recommendation today is not a specific book. It's more a style. and it's a parallel Bible. And I think that it is the best thing that you could possibly have. Now, this one is King James, NIV, NLT, and New American Standard. You can get them with different translations, but the reason I wanted to bring this up today is because I think that sometimes we get married to one translation, and the only translation we should be married to is the Greek one. And so, I think that sometimes we are so dedicated to one, and you might know this person who's a King James or only, and or a whatever. But every translation has their dedicated followers. But I think when you have more translations, you get a better picture. The analogy I've used with youth before is I've had one person go stand in the middle, and everybody circles around them. And about 4 or 5 people have to describe the person standing in the middle from their angle. And they can do it, but they're missing half, sometimes more than half, of the image of that person. And that's what we get with those translations. We circle, they each give a different picture. And so to completely get the full picture, God gave us all these different translations, and we need to be using most, if not all of them, to get really a full picture of what he's trying to tell us in that passage. And so that's my recommendation: is don't get married to a one translation of the Bible. The Bible apps make it easy. You can also get them in books. So
this is more of a PSA, public service announcement than
we can do. The more you know, little star go across the front there.
Yeah, I'll try to see if I can find it.
Okay, perfect, please.
But yeah, I agree with you totally, and that's something that I try to teach too. And when we have Bible classes, I always make sure that somebody else reads verses.
Right.
So you can kind of get those. We did one. We actually this past week, we had. We were talking about Jairus and the synagogue ruler whose daughter was sick, and this translation that this woman was reading from, it said she was a damsel, and I was like, really? Okay. But the ESV was saying like little girl, and damsel kind of throws a different thing about it.
Interesting.
It's if you don't have any knowledge of those ancient biblical languages, that's almost, I feel like, a necessity. Because you are bound to get to a passage that you really don't. It kind of seems fuzzy as to what the meaning is. But if you've got several different translations around and you're looking at several of them, you can kind of start making sense of what's trying to be put across.
Absolutely.
So
yeah,
and I appreciate that.
No, that's one thing I do too. Is I would have people read, and I would try to get as many translations, and I'd say, all right, who did not have that translation, and you're going to read next. And so that's but yeah, I don't know. PSA is a good way to put that. So. But today, we're going to kind of dive in a little bit into, Zach's kind of alluded to the Proverbs, but I want to talk about one specific individual, and maybe that's even being a little too narrow with it, because sometimes it is an actual individual with a capital letter to begin the word, but a lot of times it's not, and it's the person that Solomon refers to as foolish, or a fool, or the fool. Solomon uses this over and over again. As a matter of fact, even in Proverbs chapter 9, it's literally titled Wisdom versus Foolishness. And the entire Proverbs chapter 9 is dedicated to that. The first proverb, Proverbs 10, is really where you get to start those one-liners. And Proverbs 10, the first one, talks about being foolish. And so there's this narrative, and there's a lot of themes in Proverbs, but this is a big one, is wisdom versus foolishness. And so I want to kind of dive into some of these, but before we really get going, I want to see if Zach has anything to say about any of that.
Sure, yeah, and I think that when we look at this, we need to consider it as part of the wisdom literature. I feel like, you've got Solomon's, his books, and there are actually more people than Solomon that contributed to the Book of Proverbs.
Right.
I think sometimes we forget that. But
it's
part of so it's part of the wisdom literature, and that being the case, it's kind of trying to lay out for us, specifically the Book of Proverbs, is these are principles upon which wisdom rests. You've got Ecclesiastes that says, well, it doesn't always turn out that way, but Proverbs is kind of like, these are the general rules to live by, and generally speaking, when you do this, you're going to have a good life. You're going to be in good standing with God. You're going to live long. Your family is going to be blessed. You're going to be blessed. And so it's so important for us to study this. And I think that's why that fool keeps getting brought up throughout this book, is to put that dynamic there. I would look at a lot of Proverbs as, biblical poetry. We might think of the Psalms as biblical poetry, but Proverbs kind of follows the same kind of organization. You have these couplets. The wise does this, but the fool does this. And you have this over and over again. And so that's another way that we can look at this too. I think that just kind of in the context of this, those are perhaps some things we should consider.
Oh, absolutely. That's important to note, because that's, that you have to read it in context. I think of all the books that are easy to take out of context, Proverbs 10 through the end of the book is the easiest, because I can pick these one-liners out. And while that is good, and there's nothing wrong with that per se, there is still a bigger narrative you have to be aware of, because there's a bigger story. And it's not about being able to pick those out and prove your point to somebody, but rather there's a bigger narrative going on here, and that's with the whole Bible. It's really started for me this past week, Zach, and I was trying to figure out what we were going to talk about, and I hit Proverbs 19, and in Proverbs 19, it mentions a fool a couple different times, and so as I was reading it was just kind of interesting. I was there in verse 13 and 15, and 14 is in the middle there. But Proverbs 19 verse 13 reads as this: "A foolish son is his father's ruin, and a wife's nagging is an endless dripping." That's kind of interesting, but I'll continue. We're not done with this. Verse 14, because we can't leave it out. "A house and wealth are inherited from fathers, but a prudent wife is from the Lord." Verse 15, "Laziness includes deep sleep, and a lazy person will go hungry." And I bring in the lazy because Solomon throughout the book also combines laziness and foolishness a lot of times. So, and that's what really got me. I was like, you know what? That's what we need to talk about. Is what does it look like when you're foolish, and why does Solomon constantly condemn it? It's because of the nature of what it is. A foolish son is his father's ruin. Whether we like it or not, how the children turn out is a reflection on the parents, right? And so when we look at that, that makes sense. If you've got a child who's not acting with their brain, to be quite frank, it's why is this on the parents? Why did the parents not teach him better? And so there's a lot of that in Scripture as well. That that's not the only time there's a reflection on the parents from being a fool. But then we get down to that lazy aspect. That a lot of times foolishness and laziness are combined in Proverbs. But I also want to think about, and this whole episode, I want really, as you're listening to us, to consider as a self-reflective issue. We're not using this, and we're not picking up Proverbs and saying, "Look, you're a fool," and beating people over the heads with our Bibles. We're saying, how can I see myself in this? Is there any sliver of me in what Solomon is saying here?
Yeah, and so the thing about it is that every time we go to Scripture, I think we need to look reflectively.
Right.
The Bible is described as a mirror for a reason.
Yes.
But that being said, James talks about, he's like one that looks in the mirror and then he forgets what he looks like. This is a kind of mirror that we look at intently. Mm-hmm. And we look at it and we meditate and we realize the things that we ought to change and realize the parts of us that do not look Christ-like, and we allow the Word to, in its transformative power, make us into more like Jesus. Mm-hmm. So it's not a slight to anyone when we talk about the foolish things that are here. It's things that every one of us need to look at and realize. There is a path of righteousness. There's a path of wisdom. Ephesians chapter 4 talks about walking in wisdom. if you were to, I think it's Ephesians 4, it might be Ephesians 5, but to walk in wisdom, that's something that Christians are to do, so we must understand what is foolish. Mm-hmm. So when we come to the Bible, we look reflectively, we take note of these things, and if we see those discrepancies between ourselves and the Word, we make those changes.
Yep.
It takes humility. It takes intentfulness. Because I think oftentimes we end up being the person with the log in our eye, and we're pointing around to everybody else. You got your speck. You're a bad person. So we just have to be open. We have to be open to this.
Right, and I think that what you said is that's the whole Bible, and we could talk about that for probably 3 or 4 episodes, but yeah. I mean that there's so much about this that we miss because we forget to look at ourselves, and I'm so guilty that it's not even funny, but this is a very difficult conversation because the second that I start saying these people are doing it, then I'm immediately a hypocrite. So and that's why falls squarely into the encouragement category, that I need to be encouraging people to continue to be looking at themselves, to continue to be constantly saying, am I, and I know I'm shaking the camera by pounding on my Bible, but am I doing what Christ would have me to do? Am I walking that path? Because the second that I start saying, are they walking that path, or is he walking that path? I'm gonna go off into the woods. And when I'm driving, I don't say, all right, is that person on their phone? I mean, I do, and I see that, and I'm like, get off your phone, and I scream at them. They can't hear me. But as soon as I start to say, are they driving straight? I'm going to start veering off into the ditch. So we've got to make sure we're driving straight, and as an individual, and then we can begin to help others.
Yeah. Last thing I want to say before we dive into the full of Proverbs,
yes,
is I spoke on staying on the right track this past Sunday, and Hebrews chapter 12 verses 1 through 3. That's everything you need to know right there on how to stay on the right track. There are 3 things. You lay off the weights. The sin, other weights, you lay them off. You race with endurance. And number 3 is in verses 2 and 3. You look to Jesus. That's where your eyes are set. It's not looking around at what other people are doing. You're going to get off track if you do that. If we're going to stay on track in our faith, if we're going to increase, we look to Jesus. By extension, the Word. He is the Word. And so the book of Proverbs, inspired by the Spirit of God, this is the Word of God. When we talk about the fool here, we're not looking around again at other people. We're looking to Jesus. We're trying to become more like Him.
Absolutely. Well, the kind of place I want to start is Proverbs 10. Zach, I know if you have other verses, feel free to let's jump around to them. But I'm going to start in Proverbs 10. I kind of told you about Proverbs 19 where I started, but then as I began to look, you start at the beginning where he starts doing these one-liners, and like I said, we could read the whole chapter 9 because it's literally wisdom versus foolishness, and this is the chapter he refers to wisdom as this woman, and foolishness as a rowdy woman. There in verse 13. But I kind of want to jump into this area where it's not a person. Foolishness is not a person; it's more of a category, and so I think that's prevalent right here in chapter 10, verse 8, where let's see, I want to read 8, 9, and 10 to start, and we'll kind of go from there. A wise heart accepts commands, but foolish lips will be destroyed. And I'm going to stop there because that's kind of interesting. And there's a few of these I'm going to key on. This is one. A wise heart accepts commands. If I could instill that in my 3-year-old, then we would be golden. But foolish lips will be destroyed. There's just so many different approaches to this. If wise heart accepts commands, that are we talking about well, you just bow down to the king of the land or bow down to the president, I mean, or are we talking about, any spectrum, how does that fall in there? And then foolish lips will be destroyed. I think that we have to really look at what foolish means. Because I think that a lot of times you could classify what people say as foolish based on simple lack of information. And there's a lot of times, and I'm not talking about any one area of life, I'm talking about anything, sports, politics, religion. You can be foolish in any category because of just a simple lack of information.
Yeah, and the foolish words that come out of your mouth. I feel oftentimes that's because, and going back to the parallels, the parallel translations, the ESV says the wise in heart will receive commandments. That makes me think these are coming from God. Yeah. There's the theme as well in the book of Proverbs of this is Solomon talking to his son. You listen to what I'm saying, as your father, as your parental figure, looking to protect you and to guide you and all of that.
Correct.
The babbling fool is one that is just not thinking. One that, and what did your translation say? I don't think yours said babbling.
Foolish lips will be destroyed.
Foolish lips. So, like, if you think about foolish lips, I'm thinking about somebody who runs their mouth, and they think before they say, and that can be damning for us in the sense of our standing with others,
right,
and in the community and in the church. We end up regretting some of the things that we say, especially in anger. When we say things in anger, I mean, it's spot on. I feel like, and whatever angle you look at this, ruin, destruction. That's what comes from having those loose lips, like James says. It's like a rudder, of a ship, and it's able to guide the whole body. Your tongue is. And
and it reminds me of the saying, "A closed mouth gathers no foot." You can't stick your foot in your mouth. You can't be wrong if you don't say anything, right?
That's awesome. I've never heard that.
You've never heard that one?
I'm gonna use that though. That's awesome.
I thought that was a Southernism.
A closed mouth receives no foot.
Yep. Closed. Yep.
That's great.
So that's I can't believe you never heard that one. That's a good one. But yeah, that's what it makes me think of. It's like, hey, you can't overstep your bounds if you're quiet. And I know there's people, especially people who love me a lot, who are like, if Logan would listen to what he's saying right now. But that's something that's, we have to be cautious about because, speaking out of turn, and I'm not like, oh, well, you spoke out of turn. But, when you're speaking in an area you don't know much about, I'm someone who, I did this a little bit in college, but a lot in high school. I talked to sound, because I thought it made me sound smart. It does the opposite. And Solomon says that, not just here, but a few times. When you talk just to talk, you're gonna make yourself sound like a fool. And it's exactly what he says here.
Yeah. And I think that's reflected very well in our own lives. It seems like the wise people, the older, wiser, saints, they're kind of quiet. And for good reason.
Right. I always liked this, as Teddy Roosevelt said, speak softly and carry a big stick.
There you go.
I always wanted to be that person, but I'm just not. I try so hard. Yeah. But I want to skip down now to, let's see. And verse 10 says the same thing. A sly wink of the eye causes grief. And then he says again, and foolish lips will be destroyed. He repeats that saying in verse 10. I don't know if yours is exactly repeating. But, that same idea that talk carefully is the idea here.
Fool. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And then I want to jump down to verse 14 in the same chapter. In verse 14 of chapter 10. The wise store up knowledge. Now that seems pretty straightforward. Solomon, one of the wisest men ever. And this is pretty much, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, they were that knowledge. He stored up knowledge. So that's pretty straightforward and I think easy to comprehend.
And something about that, the there's a value to knowledge,
Right.
with that sense. I think about how Paul said in the Philippian letter, I count everything as rubbish, as garbage, for the sake of the knowledge of Jesus Christ.
Right.
So there's value behind that. He's storing it up because there's value.
Absolutely. Well, and that's exactly what it is, and it reminds me of the parable of wow, I'm going to blank on the actual parable name. The parable
Buried
of
treasure,
the farmer, the guy who stored up all his. He had to build bigger barns, and I know the parable. I just don't know the name of the parable. But it doesn't matter because that's not part of the Bible. Jesus never called it anything. It's a man-made thing, so that's why it doesn't matter. But he built up these bigger barns to store all his stuff, but he didn't have any. He didn't store up treasure in heaven. It reminds me of that. But then continuing in verse 14, he says, "But the mouth of the fool hastens destruction." And again, we're going back to the mouth of the fool. But I think that is a lot of times where you are shown to be a fool or not, right? You show who you are when you talk. What goes into your eyes, what goes into your ears, goes into your heart, comes out your mouth. So if you're somebody who understands, first of all, if you're somebody who understands you don't know much about a topic, then you will keep your mouth shut. But that's what Solomon is saying, is a fool is going to jump out and say, I do know exactly about all this and blah, 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 but in reality, you don't know anything.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I mean, you're spot on. I know what to do about that. I know what to say about that.
Right.
And not have any clue what you're talking about. I think about, Jesus talking about out of the mouth, the heart speaks. I'm trying to remember where that is, but or something along those lines.
Right.
There's that concept that what is in the heart, your mouth just sometimes it just vomits out, just comes out.
Right.
And maybe that's a different topic here, but there has to be some control over that mouth.
Yeah.
In some regard.
And we could, and this is not really where my mind went when we were talking about this, but it's where we're going here, and I'm fine with that. But you get into this idea of what gossip, we're gossiping. And so many, I'm going to be careful with this. A lot of sin has to do with your mouth, and has to do with what am I saying about others? How am I building? Am I building somebody up or am I tearing them down? And obviously not all, because there's a lot of sin that's fleshly, but there's a lot that you can do or not do with your mouth that is a sin or not a sin. Verse 18, if we keep reading in Proverbs 10, the one who conceals hatred has lying lips, and whoever spreads slander is a fool. So somebody who's intentionally spreading, maybe even not intentionally, spreading slander, bad mouthing somebody. Solomon calls them a fool. This is not somebody who's smart, because, I think personally why I read that is, if I'm somebody who's spreading slander right now, how do I know that the other people aren't going to be spreading slander about me the next day? Is kind of how I see that. So you want to be somebody who's positive, because what will people say about you? Right? You don't. Solomon's idea here is don't give somebody something negative to say about you.
Right. And oftentimes, I guess there's so many different ways that you can look at gossip. If you heard it from somewhere else, some other third party, you don't even know if that's true. And then
Correct.
You go on and you may be ruining somebody's life.
Correct.
Because of something that you were telling about somebody else. I had someone ask me about, they were talking to me about a personal situation with somebody else. And there's been difficulty there. And they were saying, well, am I gossiping about this? This individual was talking about a problem with an individual that they've been working with them and trying to resolve some issues and stuff. And, they were coming to their preacher to kind of get some encouragement. I feel like that's different. There is definitely an intention behind gossip.
Yeah.
And I think that is, I mean, it's reflected in the words that are coming out of your mouth. Why are you saying this? Is it so that you can find some solution to some issue? Are you seeking help, or are you just spreading information as a talking point? So that you can have a conversation with somebody. And I mean, it's not right. And I think the foolish person does not understand. They lack the wisdom that says this could be damaging to my own standing with others. It could be damaging to my reputation, but it can be damaging to those that are involved when I have wrong information or incomplete information. I feel like any third party with almost any situation is not going to understand the first person point of view of those who are involved. I mean, it's never going to happen.
No.
So
there's kind of a flip side to this too, though, and it's what is the beginning of the verse. The one who conceals hatred has lying lips. And so it's not necessarily a fool, but Solomon is saying, if you keeping hatred in, and maybe you're not spreading slander, but you're holding in hatred in your heart. And then he says, you have lying lips, you're fake, is what Solomon is saying. If you are concealing hatred for somebody and not telling them, or not, being honest with yourself, you're a liar, you're a fake. And that's not, maybe sometimes there's a place to be cordial, but that does not mean that you let that hatred eat your heart. And I think that's what Solomon's alluding to here, is when you bottle up hatred, it eats at you. Some people do that quicker than others. I'm not a person who bottles up hatred. I don't remember the last time somebody wronged me. I forget it. I let it go. And I'm not bragging about that. I wish I wasn't like that sometimes. But some people hold on. Some people hold on to it for years and years and years, and there's a middle ground there. And so I think that Solomon is trying to make sure that there's two sides to this, and they're both bad if you do them wrong. I've got one more verse here in Proverbs 10 before I'm going to see if Zach's got any he wants to hit through Proverbs. But Proverbs 10:21, the lips of the righteous feed many, but fools die for lack of sense. Man, what I don't even know how to begin with this one. The lips of the righteous feed many. I feel like that's pretty straightforward. And it's interesting. This is something I've preached about within the last 2 years. That when you look at Proverbs, especially Proverbs 10 here, he spends the whole time contrasting 4 different people: righteous and wicked, and foolish and wise. And then towards the end, he brings it together, and he says, the righteous are wise, and the wicked are foolish. And so that's kind of interesting as you read through this passage, and that's why you have to have the context. When you read this whole chapter in context, you see that. You see that these aren't just one at a time, that he's slowly bringing these two together as righteous and wise on one side, and foolish and wicked on the other. So here we get a little snippet of that, and if you're reading it just one at a time, you're almost like, oh, he messed up. He meant to say the lips of the wise feed many. But I don't think that's where he's going with this. He's starting to mold these two together. That when you're wise, you are righteous, because that's what wisdom brings, is righteousness. And wickedness brings about foolishness. So the lips of the righteous feed many, but the fools die for lack of sense. Would you mind reading that, Zach, in your translation? Verse 21.
So Proverbs 10:21. The lips of the righteous feed many, but fools die for lack of sense.
Oh, wow. And that's a rare version, or that's a rare example of two translations matching pretty closely, which to me shows that that's pretty close to what we would say in English.
Pretty cut and dry, yeah.
Yeah. So, but the lips of the righteous feed many. That's going to be something you take in. You think about someone in your life who is, who's always feeding people, spiritually speaking. I would consider that person righteous. Sometimes, it can be fake food. There's just because everybody's human. Just because they have a following does not necessarily mean that what they're saying is right. But I think the second part is 100% true. Fools die for lack of sense. I don't even know how to say that. What else can you say? There's no more commentary needed on that.
Well, I think that, this kind of goes back to what we said about, the righteous feed many. The righteous have something of value to give. The righteous, the wise have something that they have been given, in a spiritual context. It's wisdom which comes from above, wisdom which comes from God, which is far more valuable. The foolishness of God is greater than the wisdom of man. There's value in the righteous. When it says the fools die for lack of sense, I think about the false teachers who are waterless springs. They look like they have something of value, but it's just ruin. It's just death. There's nothing of value there. And I think that is something we need to take when we're talking about this combination with righteousness and wisdom and wickedness and foolishness. There's value. There's value. And I think that every individual, regardless of where they are, whether they believe in God or not, they want to have value in their life. And I think this is kind of a way where we can kind of connect. We all want to have something valuable. We all want to have something that is bigger than ourselves. And so when I think Proverbs could potentially be a great way of evangelizing to some, because these are principles that you can look at and, wow, that makes a lot of sense. It makes sense to and you could just pull out anything. Yeah, when pride comes, then comes disgrace. But with the humble is wisdom. That's Proverbs chapter 11 verse 2. Pride comes before the fall. Everybody knows that. That saying. That's scripture. And so I think that we have to understand there's value here. The fool dies for lack of sense because they don't hold anything of value. They don't have anything to give. No life comes from this kinds of foolishness.
Yeah. Well, and there's a lot. I mean, we could go through the whole thing, and I'm interested to know if you have any more passages that you came up with, Zach. But that's exactly right. That's what this is about, and that's why I wanted to. This is what I wanted to talk about, and I'll have one more to close this out in a second. But when we look at this, when we pick this up, that's why you can. It's so cut and dry that it allows us to be able to say, "Oh man, that looking in the mirror here."
Yeah.
And so the fear of the Lord prolongs life in verse 27. This is just a random one, but the years of the wicked are cut short. And that's a thought. That's a thought turner. That's one that's going to start turning the thoughts in your head. That the fear of the Lord, literally, Solomon is saying, it adds days to your life. And so maybe there's no scientific way to prove that. But Solomon is saying, as a wise man, I've watched it. The people who fear God, they're living longer. And I don't know why, but that's just what it is. And the days of the wicked are cut short. I've got my theory, but Solomon is saying, I don't got proof other than what I see. And so there's one, and you can just keep pulling them out one by one. How is this applying to me? And how can I take this wisdom and apply it to myself? And Proverbs is a good place to start, but it's towards the middle of the Bible, and you've got all this over here and all this over here that does the exact same thing when you have an open heart and an open mind and you're ready for it. And I think that's the crazy thing about this book, and it's the greatest book because of that. And I totally just went off on a big tangent there, but there you go. So,
no, man, you're good. Speaking to the fact that he talks about, you live this way, those who are wise, they typically live longer. Making a connection to the book of Ecclesiastes, actually, where he talks about, I have seen the wicked prosper, and I have seen the righteous, die in their righteousness early. But then he makes the point that even though that has happened, it's so much better to live in righteousness. It's so much better to live in wisdom. You know, but some things that I want to take from this directly is, I don't necessarily have some passages I want to look at. I want to look rather at some concepts that are taught that have to do with this foolishness. And I don't think the word fool or foolishness is even used in them, but I think that we can make that connection. Let's talk about discipline. You know, the command or the idea that a father, you know, specifically, you know, parents are to discipline their children. Why are they supposed to do that? You know, so that they grow up in the admonition and the teachings of the Lord. You know, several different places in the book of Proverbs this is taught. You know, you spare the rod. It's not spare the rod, spoil the child. It's spare the rod, and I'm trying to think of exactly how it's worded. You know, you beat them with the rod and you deliver their soul from hell. I mean, that's specifically stated here. It's foolish to think, well, I don't have to discipline my children. I'm going to be their best friend, and I'm going to take a friendship role or a brother or a sister role to my child, rather than take a parental role. What are the problems with that you see, Logan, when you kind of push out the parental role, with the discipline and the teaching, and substitute that with something that is more friendly and more, you know, less controversial and less conflict and all of that?
It's funny, though, you said it the way you did, because my daughter has been on this kick where she's saying, you're my best friend or you're not my best friend. And when she's mad at me, I'm not her best friend. And I have not said it yet, but I have thought, well, I'm not trying to be your best friend. And but even in my heart, I'm like, no, I want to be your best friend. But like that's not what God called me to be. And so, but it's funny when she gets in trouble, I am not her best friend, and she lets me know that, and I just laugh. But yeah, that's what it is. It's like, you know, that's not the role God gave me. And it's interesting because when you accept the role of a parent, then when that child gets to be the age, you know, when they're an adult, then you can have a more friendly relationship. It's no longer a parent-child relationship like you knew. And it can be a more friendly relationship, a more brother-sister or sister, however you want to say it, relationship, as opposed to a parent-child.
Yeah, I think that's true in a sense. You know, I feel like, you know, I'm always going to see Graham as my baby boy.
Right.
You know, I'm always going to see him that way. But when he is an adult, then I can treat him like an adult.
Right.
He is not an adult.
Correct.
he is a toddler, you know, so I have to treat him, you know, he is my toddler son. So he understands now. I have a hard time with him listening sometimes, but he knows when I count to 3. When I start with 1, he listens at that point. You know, and so he has to, you know, that's part of that discipline.
Right.
I have to count to 3 sometimes, you know, and he knows what happens if I say 3. He knows. So, I mean, but that is teaching him to, one, respect the authority of, you know, that parental figure, you know, his father. If he doesn't understand discipline from that, how is he going to understand the discipline of the Lord? I mean, there's so much foolishness in the idea that, well, I can just be a friend to my child and I don't really have to discipline them. And maybe, you know, I understand and I agree with some parts of, you know, the distraction, you know, well, let's go do this instead. Right. You know, let's get your mind off of this thing that I don't want you doing and go do this instead. I do that with him sometimes. Right. But at the same time, he has to understand, you know, there is an authority there with that parental figure. Now, there's another thing I want to talk about that has to do with foolishness. It seems that one of the most foolish people that there are in the book of Proverbs is the kind of man who gives into the seductive charms of the adulteress. Now, you know, this is consistent through the book as well. I mean, the entirety of chapter 5 and chapter 7 really talk about this adulterous woman. Describes her with this great detail. Her lips drip with honey. You know, she seizes you and she kisses you. She has this passion, you know, and it's just like, ooh. I mean, you kind of have that feeling about this woman. She has these intoxicating words, but Solomon's very clear, son, you don't go after that woman, because you know what's going to happen? She's going to drag your soul to hell. I mean, that's he's so explicit with that. There is so much foolishness with that. And in our world today, they don't see that foolishness. You know, adultery is kind of seen like as something, oh, I'm so sorry that happened to you. Rather than look at that as, that is a wicked sin. That is a bad thing. It's not just the fact that, you know, they hurt you by doing that. It's that they've done something wrong. Right. In and of that. You know, there seems to be no remorse or little remorse for the act of that until you get caught. I mean, and it's just like, this is almost like a norm, you know, that people just, they are not faithful to each other. And going beyond that, there's all this, you know, premarital sex and fornication of all kinds that, you know, they give into the intoxicating seductress. You know, I've laid out my bed for you, and I've done all of this, and my husband's not home, and, you know, all these intoxicating words. And it's foolishness. It's just foolishness. Yeah. Maybe you have something to say about that. I don't know. I think that's important, though, because there's there's so many different kinds of foolishness. We've talked a lot about the foolishness of our words, you know, which comes out of our heart. We've talked about, you know, gossip and other things, but I think that there's so many facets of just the lack of wisdom. We have to pursue this. We have to pursue wisdom, right? And we can't neglect all facets of this.
Correct. Well, and that's something that is kind of interesting when you phrase it that way, the pursuit of wisdom, because wisdom doesn't need you. And that kind of can sound harsh, but it's not the one that's coming after you like the foolishness or those sinful desires are coming after you. When you look at what's coming after you is those things, the sinful desires and the foolishness, whereas wisdom is like, you know what, I'm here, but you have to want me. And that's exactly the way God is. I'm here, but I want you to want me. And that's our relationship with God. That's our relationship with wisdom. And it's interesting. That's why Solomon was blessed, because he said, I want wisdom, God. I don't want these things. Right off the bat, which is crazy to me, because then later on, after he got all the wisdom, is when he pursued all that stuff. But, you know, whatever, Solomon.
Whatever, man.
do you. But he did, and he said, God, I don't want these things you're offering, because God was offering him, I'll give you anything, give you riches, give you more power. And he said, I just want wisdom. And that is probably one of the top moments of strength that you can find in the Bible, in my opinion. That in that moment, Solomon had the strength of will and the strength of his soul to say, I don't need anything physical. I just need your wisdom. And it didn't last, because he later on tripped up, and obviously we can read that. But in that moment, he was so strong to pursue wisdom like that. And, you know, we're not always going to be that person, but that's what we should be striving for. We should be pursuing wisdom like Solomon did in that moment. Kind of to wrap up, I want to leave us with this passage. This verse is Proverbs 3:35. And it reads as follows: The wise will inherit honor, but he who holds up fools to dishonor. So those who are going to be, the wise will inherit honor. those are the people that God is going to look at with honor. Because when you've pursued wisdom, when you've spent your life pursuing wisdom instead of pursuing other things, God sees that as an honorable thing. When in reality, at the end of your life, if you've been holding up fools and you've been just allowing yourself to just be thrown around pursuing foolishness and pursuing things that make you feel good, you receive dishonor. You inherit dishonor. And so that's kind of interesting, and just kind of a thought, kind of to wrap a nice little bow on this thought on my end. So Zach, I don't know if you have anything to say about that, but that was the verse that kind of just, and it's early in the passage, it's early in Proverbs, but I think it puts a nice bow on what Solomon wants to say about wisdom and foolishness.
Right. I guess there's one passage that I agree. I think that sums it up very well. Another one is Proverbs 4 and verse 5. Mm-hmm. Get wisdom, get insight. Yep. Do not forget, and do not turn away from the words of my mouth. Solomon, in all of this, he is reflecting not just his own experience, not just the wisdom. I guess it is the wisdom which God had given to him. Mm-hmm. This is something that has come from the Father. This has come from God. I think that it's important too that we remember the premise of this book. Mm-hmm. At the very beginning in the book of Proverbs chapter 1, starting in verse 1, the Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel, to know wisdom and instruction, to understand words of insight. And then verse 7 says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. Yep. So, it all goes back to where's our mind set on? If our mind is set on God and doing the will of God, then we will increase in wisdom. God says, the book of James too, if anyone lacks wisdom, where do you go? Where do you go for wisdom? You ask God, and that's a prayer that's difficult to do sometimes. Mm-hmm. Sometimes God gives us wisdom by the situations that he puts into our lives. I don't know if you remember, maybe he never said this in the class that you were in. Maybe you didn't have a class with him. Dan Winkler, mm-hmm. He said he stopped praying for wisdom because God was putting him in situations in which he was gaining wisdom mm-hmm. that were difficult, different trials and different things like that. But anyway, I agree with you there. Proverbs 3:35. The ESV says the wise will inherit honor, but fools will get disgrace. Mm-hmm. Those who hold up fools, again, there's no value, there's no life, there's nothing that comes from it. And so we have to think critically. We have to think critically about what direction we are moving in.
Right. Absolutely. Well, Zach, thank you for the conversation today, man. This has been good. I enjoy Proverbs a lot. I think it's probably my favorite book in the Old Testament by far, but it's definitely up there in the New Testament. I just like to be able to sit there and read it because my brain can ping pong around and then come right back, and I didn't miss anything. So, but yeah, I like Proverbs. Every time I read it, I learn something new. So I appreciate the conversation today, man.
Yeah, I think it's one thing to say, kind of go through the book of Proverbs yourself and kind of read through, and you get all these unrelated things. It seems like I think they are related in some ways, but they get these unrelated things, and it's just kind of like, this is so much to take in. Mm-hmm. I think it's something else to be able to have a conversation and talk about it. So thank you.
Absolutely. Well, I'm going to let you close this in prayer, and thank you for joining us today.
All right, let's pray. God, we thank you so much for this blessing that we've had to consider your word and consider wisdom. I ask, dear Lord, that you help us to all, our listeners and ourselves, to pursue wisdom, and to look after Jesus, to keep him in the forefront of our minds in all that we do. We thank you for his sacrifice. We pray for this work that we're doing, and I ask, dear Lord, that you'll bless it and you'll bless all of our listeners. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thanks for watching.